What if we've been thinking about self-esteem in the wrong way? Most of us think that self-esteem is a bit like inflating a balloon. You have to keep on filling it with esteemable acts or confidence in your own capabilities until it becomes bigger or more substantial. Now, while that is partially true, there are a couple of other ways to improve self-esteem that we just don't talk about enough. And the first is about letting go of a different type of balloon. Let me explain. My name is Oliver, he's Gogo, and you're watching My People Patterns. Hit subscribe if you want to know more about the way I work, how I think about psychology, and if you're interested in growing great relationships with yourself and others. I think there are multiple ways that we need to think about self-esteem, and definitely one part is our capacity to have confidence in our abilities, to recognize and believe in our own worth. But let's imagine that there are three zones of self-esteem. There's obviously low self-esteem, we might have a healthy sense of self-esteem, and there's an overly inflated sense of self-esteem that we might call grandiosity. Obviously, we want to be in the middle zone of healthy self-esteem. The traditional thinking about someone with low self-esteem is that you need to build it up so that it floats higher in the middle zone. It's a matter of holding on to things that build esteem, the behaviors that you exhibit, your personal abilities, your unique capabilities and how you value yourself. Things that make you proud. The inflation of a low self-esteem to a healthy sense of esteem comes in part from other people. It's recognizing and holding on to compliments and savoring them. So you have to see your self-worth and value in what other people are saying, but it's also your job to hold on to them. I think self-esteem comes from relationships is what I'm saying. But that is not all we need to think about. We also have to look at our super self. So in order to understand the super self, let's go back to some psychoanalytic theory, and you may want to fast forward unless you're a therapist, because this is all about how we see the world and how we see ourselves starting from when we're born. So at birth, the baby's sense of self is very much entwined with the caregiver, so much so that Freud actually thought there was a complete lack of self in a newborn baby. I think that later got disproved, but we can imagine still to this day that the baby's sense of identity is pretty much non-existent. They're still trying to figure out what the hell's going on. As the baby gets older, their sense of self fills in more, and by the time they're an adult, they have a hopefully more complete sense of identity and self. So over time, we can see how our self changes, but we also have to consider that there are others as well as the self. Now, as an adult, we all know there's a me and a you. The same is not true for a baby. Newborn babies are thoroughly egocentric. It's all about them. They think that they are the only ones on the planet and the world revolves around them. This is what we call in babies and young children a healthy sense of narcissism. They really think the world is all about them, and that's okay because they're young and developing. We can imagine to the baby the primary caregiver comes because the baby demands it. They're still quite egocentric, right? But they do develop a sense of I and not I, self and other. The realization that the world is actually made up of a lot of other people and not just self is a really tough pill for the baby to swallow. The only way that they can make sense of other people existing in what was previously their world is to make everyone else all bad and them all good. It's some psychological growth when the baby can conceive that there are other people in the world, but it's still a bit obnoxious. And you can see this in adults today who get stuck in that zone. They're a bit out of touch with reality. They think that everyone else is bad and they're the best. These sort of people can't be in relationships with others because other people are devalued. You might be thinking of certain famous politicians right now. Rightly so. The next phase of development that occurs is the realization that actually no one is all good and no one is all bad. You are part good and part bad, and unfortunately I'm part good and also part bad. No one's perfect. To deal with the very depressing reality that we are all a little bit good and a little bit bad, we create the super self. It is the version of yourself that would exist if you could hold on to the idea that you are all good. It's the perfect you, the super self. If we go back to our levels of self-esteem idea, the super self is obviously the perfect version of us. It belongs, therefore, at the top of the chart. The super self can work a full day at the office, hand in all the work they need to, go to the gym, meditate, read, take the kids to soccer, hang with friends for a quick drink, and be back in time to cook dinner and read the kids a story before bed. No one can do all of that, but your super self can. When regular you, who is somewhere in the middle zone, comes across an event or a situation like getting an F in a piece of homework or not doing so well in your work review, we are very likely to compare ourselves to the super self. Because obviously the super self would have gotten A+ in their homework because they're perfect. When we compare ourselves to our super self, we start feeling bad about ourselves. Super self got an A+, and therefore I should be as good as they are, and I'm an idiot or worthless or useless because I didn't do as well as my super self. Now, comparing yourself to your super self is a terrible idea. Not only are you comparing yourself to a flawless version of yourself that is incapable of making mistakes, you're comparing yourself to something that you completely made up. It's like comparing yourself to Superman and feeling crappy about yourself because you can't fly or shoot laser beams out of your eyes. And the reality is no one can fly and no one can shoot laser beams out of their eyes. And Superman isn't real. So one of the ways that we need to think about building self-esteem is by popping the bubble that we create around our super self. Now, it's okay to aspire to be closer to the super self. It's okay to want A+ in your exams. But comparing yourself is a horrible idea. It's a very slippery slope to low self-esteem and depression. In my clinical work, when I start working with somebody who might have some depression or low self-esteem, I'm first of all going to assess what they make of their super self. Like, what does it look like? Is this super self already a famous actor? Is it a Grammy-winning singer or just getting straight A's in their homework? If I can get a very clear idea of this idealized version of themselves, we can start our work in understanding the comparison that goes on. My next step then is to get clients to catch when they're making comparisons to themselves, to their super self. And I think often it starts with a should. Oh, I should have been able to get a better grade, or I should have been able to fit dinner and drinks and yoga and meditation into my evening. I think once they catch on to the shoulds and realize that's a comparison to this fictitious part of themselves, then the real work begins. But once we can see that we're making these comparisons and we become more aware of when we do it, then it's much easier to stop. I think once they realize how ridiculous it is that they're comparing themselves to a made-up version of themselves that's perfect, it's much easier for them to stop doing it. Once they stop doing it, obviously, I start seeing changes in their self-esteem and how they feel about things, and more importantly, how they think about the world and themselves. So this is one of the ways that we can help grow our self-esteem when we give up the comparison to a crazy part of ourselves that we made up when we were kids.